that each member unmutes and indicates that during the roll call, the vote, that they have voted either yay or nay. Otherwise, you will be shown as not being in attendance for the vote. You have an obligation under Florida statutes to vote for every item in front of you. Thank you.
Thank you. The next agenda item will be the approval of the Strategic Planning and External Relations Committee meeting minutes from February 17th, 2020. You can find the minutes on page 4 of your packet. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
Director McLean, motion to approve.
Okay, we have a motion to approve the minutes.
Director Harden, second.
I'm sorry. So Adam Harden was the second. Who was the motion then?
Director McLean.
Oh, okay. Okay. So we have a motion to approve and a second. I guess we're going to have a roll call vote. Is that true?
Yes, ma'am. So the motion is to approve the minutes from the February 17th, 2020 Strategic Planning and External Relations Committee meeting. It was made by Director Harden and seconded by Director McLean. Please say yay or nay after your name. Commissioner Pat Kemp?
Yes.
Director Adam Harden?
Yes.
Mayor Jane Castor? Director Richard McLean?
Yes.
Director David Mechanic?
Yes.
Commissioner Kimberly Overman?
Yes.
Director Kathleen Shanahan? Motion passes with a vote of 5-0.
The next agenda item is public comment. HART General Counsel Julia Mandel will read into the record the rules for public participation.
Good morning again. The board welcomes public comments about any issues and concerns and has made provisions to allow for virtual public comment. Public comments offered virtually will be afforded equal consideration as if they were offered in person. Anyone wanting to provide public comment for any HART committee or board shall do so by contacting Danielle Arthur, board administrator at arthurd@gohart.org, ARTHURT at GOHART.org, or at 813-955-2426 with your name and phone number for pre-registration. Comments are due by 5 p.m. the day previous of the meeting. Staff will call on speakers by name in the order in which registrations are received. All callers will be muted upon calling and unmuted in the submission order after being recognized by name. Please state your full name, organization, address if desired. Up to 3 minutes will be allowed for each speaker, and the speaker will be muted once time is up. Thank you. Staff, please proceed.
Okay. Are there any public comments?
There is no one signed up for public comment. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And because we're a half hour into this meeting already and started late, I'd really like to, at this time, if there's no objection, to either push out or postpone till the next time the Plant City Transit Master Plan, and like to go right to the tip item on our agenda. Are there any objections to doing that? Okay. If we can, Mr. Cochran, you're recognized for the 2026 tip improvement priorities.
Do we need this is Commissioner Overman. Do we need a motion to postpone that agenda item?
I'm sorry, yes. If you're going to postpone an agenda item, please go ahead and make a motion to postpone it. If you're going to put it on a specific meeting, add that into the motion.
This is Commissioner Overman. I'll move to postpone item 4A, the Plant City Transit Master Plan study, to the next strategic planning meeting. assuming that doesn't need to be approved at the next board meeting, but if it's accommodable, to move that item to the next strategic planning meeting.
And do we have a second?
Director McLean, second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second, and can we do a roll call?
Yes, ma'am. The motion was made by Commissioner Overman and seconded by Director McLean to postpone action or item 4A to the next committee meeting. Please say yea or nay after your name. Commissioner Pat Kemp?
Yes.
Director Adam Hardin?
Yes.
Mayor Jane Castor? Director Richard McLean?
Yes.
Director David Mechanic?
Yes.
Commissioner Kimberly Overman?
Yes.
Director Kathleen Shanahan? Motion
Yes.
pass. Oh, thank you. Motion passes 5-0, or 6-0, I apologize. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Cochran, you're recognized on the tip priorities.
Thank you, Commissioner. Today, I bring to you a brief overview of our fiscal year 2026 tip priorities list that we have presented to the MPO that is scheduled to go before the June 2020 MPO Board of Directors. For those of you who are not part of the MPO board, just a quick background on what the TIP is. This essentially is the short-range component of the MPO's long-range transportation plan. At this current time, that the MPO has issued its 2045 long-range transportation plan, and HART has submitted a proposal list, which is part of this presentation, its priorities for the fifth year of that 2045 long-range plan. So every year we update the fifth year out, and that is that assists in the MPO and DOT and prioritizing funding for projects to come up in the future. Next slide, please. So the gist of this list of priorities includes a number of projects that span all departments of the agency, and primarily within what the MPO's long-range transportation plan classifies as preservation of the system performance area. There are a couple in what's called the real choices when not driving, but there are these categories that these projects fit within, and we are to assign them within these categories, and there's more detailed information on those within the long-range transportation plan. And looking back, traditionally, this list of priorities is not necessarily brought before the board for approval and is not a required action item. However, this year we saw that at the MPO, the March MPO Policy Committee, we did hear and understand that there was some interest in hearing and learning more about this list from members of that committee, so we felt it necessary to bring it before you today to discuss. With that, on this slide and also in your packet, you will see the letter that was sent from Miss House Stewart to Miss Alden, the director of the MPO, executive director of the MPO, our current list of priority projects. So with that, would like to open it up to any questions and discussions and your concerns as to this list of projects.
This is Commissioner Kemp, and does anybody have their hands raised? Okay. Commissioner Overman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chair. The list we've seen before, and it looks like it's in line with the priorities as far as growing and maintaining our HART system. I realize this is about 5 years out, but recently we saw that the Board of County Commissions chose not to pursue preserving the Surtax. While we haven't had a decision from the Supreme Court at this point as to the preservation of that surtax, how many items on this list that we've got on our priority list were surtax-funded match projects? Looks like we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There's about 20 projects. Is it safe to assume that a majority of these projects, if they were funded by FDOT in partnership with our agency, that the matching requirements by HART would still be required? And so, if so, how many of these projects were surtax revenue dependent?
So most all of these projects, to the best of my knowledge, would require matches to them if DOT funding was supplied for these. And from what I'm looking here, I believe there's only 2 on here, maybe 3 that are not on the Surtax funding, and that's the scheduling software and the fiber optic ring between jurisdictions. The rest, I believe, are all projects that we had. The other one, I'm not 100, and I apologize. There's a lot of projects and information that we put in there. Perhaps the CNG compressor was not, but I believe we just made an amendment to move that up to this year that you all approved. So that will be actually coming off of this list next year, if I'm not mistaken.
So, Chris, am I to understand, this is Commissioner Overman, follow up to clarify Chris's answer? So, of the projects on the 2026 priorities, a majority of them are dependent on additional revenue sources beyond what we currently have as funding, whether or not we have a surtax currently or we have one that comes back to the voters in 2022. Is that correct?
Yes, Commissioner, that is correct. But regardless of that fact, we have to submit our list of priorities, or we do not get the initial funding offer. Initial funding opportunities from DOT in the first place. The MPO will take this list as well as other priorities from the City of Tampa and others and combine them all and come up with a list of priorities that are combined from multiple agencies to present to DOT. And at this point in time, they are, I believe they've come up with their primary list of priorities. But regardless of whether these are directly associated with the surtax funding, these are projects that we would have to submit every year anyway, just for them to be considered regardless.
Yes. Cindy, Ms. Stiglitz, you're recognized.
Yes, good morning. Thank you. For the record, Cindy Stiglitz, interim CFO for HART. So I want to give a little bit of perspective on what you see in front of you as far as the list of priorities, how that is actually funded, and then how that also translates into a match requirement. So every year, as Chris said, we do this for a 5-year lookout for our priorities. If I'm looking back at the last four years of funding, the funding that was allocated in 17 was $8.3 million, and it was primarily for buses. Again, FY18, it was $6.3 million for buses. In FY19, $6.1 million, primarily for the CAD AVL, but that was for buses. However, we were able to do a swap out. So we accelerated the CAT AVL project funding. That was a $10 million allocation, I believe, in 2023. And we switched with our bus funding as a priority for us at the moment. And then in FY20, we have another $4 million that was allocated for buses, which we are actually using to replace vans. So I give that historical perspective because I want to show that while we have $100 million worth of requests on that list, the funding that is actually allocated to us is far less. These do not come directly from FDOT, nor do they come directly from the MPO. They are allocated in the region. We apply for them directly to FTA. They are Surface Transportation Block Grant funding. It is actually an FHWA transfer. So the funding comes directly from us or from FTA to us through this process. So I also lend that to the discussion because what we use as a match currently for those requests are toll revenue credits. So while we do need to demonstrate a 20% match, we get that through a soft match through FDOT. But to the bigger point of these projects and how they translate then into the IOC list or using Surtax, obviously you can see that there are quite a few projects on that list that far exceed what we would ever get through this process. And many of those similar projects are on the IOC list that we presented back in September. But keep in mind, what we presented back in September was just a short-term look ahead. It was only for the use of that funding from FY19 into FY20. So, yes, many of those projects, if they weren't funded through the TIP priority process, they would fall to sales tax or some alternate form of revenue in order to move forward with those projects. Thank you.
Are there any others with, yes?
This is Dave Mechanic. I would just like to comment on the fact that the surtax is still legally on the books today, and if those circumstances change, then we might obviously need to revisit this question. But for the time being, the tax is legally imposed and it's being collected, and I think we should simply proceed based on the current state of affairs.
Thank you. Is there anybody else on with their hands raised? Okay, thank you. I would just like to say that I think it's very important that this goes through the HART board for approval. This is our future, and this is our, what we have designated for the future, what we want. And so I think it's very important that these are presented. Several members of the MPO were a little taken aback. We also had the same thing go on at the county commission with regards to an item that last year, this came up because it hit the MPO at midnight last year, and several commissioners pulled an item that staff had submitted. And I think it's very important that this is not a staff activity, but that this is an activity that comes forward with approval by this committee, by the board, in terms of setting our future and our priorities. So for the record, I'll say that right now, and I'm glad it came back to us. It needed to, so that we can start exercising some vision here about what HART should be for the future. And policy.
Do we need a motion to present this to the board for approval?
I do not think so. I mean, this is coming to the full. Is it coming to the full board? Let me ask that to Ms. Stewart.
We can put it on the agenda for the full board. This is Danielle from HART.
So it wasn't going to be? Well, then, because it wasn't going to be, I do think it would be a good thing to have a motion in regards to that, Commissioner Overman.
This is Julia Mandel, and I would agree that if it's not intended to be an action item or an item brought forward to the full board, then I would say that you all should make a motion to have it placed on the full board agenda.
Thank you.
This is Dave Mechanic. I'll move that.
Okay. We have a motion and a second. Any other discussion? Hearing none, let's, can you please call the roll?
I heard two motions. Who do we have as a second?
Commissioner Overman made the motion and David Mechanic made the second.
Yes. Thank you very much for that clarification. So we have a motion to move item 4B to the full board of directors for presentation, made by Commissioner Overman, seconded by Director Mechanic. Please say yea or nay after your name is called. Commissioner Pat Kemp?
Yes.
Director Adam Harden?
Yes.
Mayor Jane Castor? Director Richard McLean?
Yes.
Director David Mechanic?
Yes.
Commissioner Kimberly Overman?
Yes.
Director Kathleen Shanahan?
Yes.
Motion passes 6-0.
Thank you. So I think we have no, do we have any further discussion? And I guess we can move on to the next presentation, which is Mr. DeLegal. You're recognized for the state legislative post-session 2020 report.
Good morning. This is Mark DeLegal from Holland and Knight.
I said your name wrong. Sorry.
Oh, that's fine. It's fine. Good morning. Okay. Well, let me get started with the slide presentation, and I'll run through that, and then, of course, answer any questions at the end. So next slide, please. So to set the table, the session started in January. It was set to end on March 13th. Because the budget negotiations bogged down, the legislature ended up extending to March 19th, where they came to Tallahassee and voted out the budget. There were typically thousands of bills filed. I think the notable thing is there was only 210 total bills that passed the legislature this year. Of those 210 bills, only 15 have yet to be what is known as presented to the governor. 195 of them remain sitting with the presiding officers of the House and the Senate and have not been presented. So the clock has not begun to run on the governor's action on them. Next slide, please. A little bit on the basics of the budget. The budget passed by the legislature was $93 billion. There is approximately $4 billion in reserves. That is a number that you will hear thrown around a lot in the media. There is debate about whether that is really $4 billion or something less. There's a school of thought that it's more in the neighborhood of $1.3 billion, and if you tap the remaining reserves, it jeopardizes the state's bond rating, which then would increase the borrowing costs. As to the general issue of transportation, there was a $10.3 billion spent under the transportation. A lot of that is federal money, of course. $9.3 billion appropriated for the transportation work program, and then, of course, program funding for the transportation disadvantage and other county-based transportation programs. Next slide, please. Okay, I went back and I looked at our plan that we put together last fall about how we were going to proceed. And I wanted to essentially match our plan with our performance. So HART staff, that was Director Lorena Hardwick, came to Tallahassee and twice, and we met with various legislators and staff members to advocate our agenda. We had meetings with members of the delegation, budget chairs, committee staff, the Department of Transportation, the governor's office, to outline our priorities. In addition, by way of example, we had Commissioner Overman visit Tallahassee, and we met with her, and she was also an advocate on our behalf. One other thing, we had weekly calls with HART staff, including Interim CEO Stewart and Director Hardwick. Next slide, please. This was our agenda. We were looking for $600,000 that was part of the CAT ABL radio upgrade system. We were supporting a transportation worker safety package, which included 4 elements. We ended up needing to oppose some efforts to increase the liability costs of the bus system. And we also had to oppose an effort to make it more expensive and handcuff our ability to borrow money in the future. Let me specifically, I know you know the radio issues well and the transit worker safety issue well. Let me dig slightly deeper on sovereign immunity. So there was a bill filed in the legislature to increase the sovereign limits for all sovereign entities, not just public transit agencies, but all cities, counties, hospitals, the state itself, schools, public universities, etc., from $300,000 to $1 million. In addition, it removed, there's a sub-limit on an individual. No one individual could get more than $200,000. That was repealed. And then it looks innocuous, but it's actually very dangerous. And what it does is it, quote, allows the settlement above the sovereign limits by any sovereign entity with or without insurance. And that dramatically changes the leverage in any type of a tort negotiation. The other issue that I want to just mention a little bit more about is the transportation surtax. So in a worst case scenario, the Supreme Court does not approve our surtax. We have to go back out to the voters. There was language that was put in the House version of the tax bill that said that the ordinance or the referendum could only last for 20 years, and you had to go back out to the voters every 20 years. That would limit the ability to borrow and increase the cost of borrowing, and nobody in the world of public finance thought that was a good idea. I'll speak more about that as we go along. Next slide, please. So, again, following up on what our plan was that we developed in October and matching it to what we actually did. So, with respect to the radio request, we developed our request. We secured Representative Toledo and Senator Cruz to sponsor. Our staff developed some excellent collateral material. We had meetings with the chairs of the 2 appropriations subcommittees, that's Jay Trumbull from Panama City and Jeff Brandis from Pinellas County. We met with the House and Senate staff and others to advocate this. Next slide, please. As to the transit safety bill, our steps were as follows. We researched Florida law, federal proposals in other states. We developed, using some creative ideas, the 4-part package. We developed a coalition with the Florida Sheriff's Association. Kim Case, who's on the phone, I'm thinking she's muted, but she's on. She was the coordinator of the coalition with the Florida Sheriffs, the Hillsborough County State Attorney's Office, Sheriff's Office in Hillsborough County, as well as our State Trade Association and individual transit agent, Pinellas, and then the transit workers unions, not only our own, but also statewide and some local. We worked with Representative Mike Beltran from our home county and Senator Keith Perry. We selected those two, one because Mike Beltran was from our home county, and we approached him about the issue, and he was excited to support us. As to Senator Perry, this started at one of the components of the package is a criminal justice issue. Senator Perry is chairman of the Criminal Justice Committee, and so protocol is that we approached him first, and when we did, he said, I like the issue, I want to take it on. So he agreed to be the sponsor. Next slide, please. So we had a press conference in Tallahassee that was organized by HART staff. Director Malloy was in attendance. We had members of the House and Senate, including our sponsors, who were with us, and all of the coalition partners that were previously mentioned, all attended the press conference, and we got quite a bit of news out of it, and I'll show you that in a moment. So we obviously did the textbook things you do to pass a bill. You lobby the House and Senate members, delegation members, and it's notable that our bill was heard in 4 committees in the Florida House and Senate combined, and we had unanimous support, which was remarkable because on the committee we had a couple of...
You had the last part of this was on the next page down.
So can this be on its own page?
Hello? Somebody's talking.
Yeah.
Okay.
Somebody's talking, not on mute.
Adam Harden, you need to mute your phone.
Okay, so let me go back. So we were heard in 4 committees, and what I think is remarkable of noting is one of the challenges that we faced, we knew going in with respect to our enhanced criminal penalties for assaulting a bus driver was that there's actually from the right and the left 2 schools of thought. One is it's commonly referred, and I'm not a criminal justice expert, but I believe it's commonly referred as smart justice. And you see there's a movement, and the leading mover of that issue is actually 2 local folks to the Tampa Bay area, Senator Brandis and Representative Jamie Grant, who are, I would call, criminal justice reformers. And then you have maybe from the left political perspective, folks that would say we don't need to enhance the penalties to lock up more people, and particularly people who are riding our bus system. So the fact that we were able to present this in such a way, and we had both groups end up voting for our bill, was a surprise and was a nice surprise. The last thing I would say on this, where we ended up, unfortunately, is that we stalled in the Senate Rules Committee and in the House State Affairs Committee, despite considerable efforts to move the bill along. It's probably a result of a combination of session was winding down. There was a narrow funnel of bills that we're going to get through the committee process and through the whole legislature. And then I think we encountered, particularly on the House side, someone who is in that camp and category of we should not be enhancing penalties on folks. And despite the fact that we worked hard and thought we had support, we ended up ultimately not getting there. So next slide, please. This slide just shows a lot of the media, not all of the media that we received on the issue. So the good news is there was enhanced awareness in the community among the lawmakers about our issue. Next slide, please. So I've covered our work plan with respect to our appropriations request and our policy initiative, let me briefly close by speaking about our work plan on sovereign immunity and the transportation surtax. So on sovereign immunity, the issue was never introduced in the Florida House. However, we worked hard to make sure it was not introduced. We had several meetings with the chairman of the Civil Justice Committee, Representative Bob Rommel, as well as chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and urged that this issue was not ripe to be considered. In the Senate, unfortunately, the bill moved through two stops, and we worked with a coalition of cities, counties, school boards, etc., to oppose it. We also worked with the governor's office. The governor, as the head of the state coffers, had an interest in not seeing this happen. And the short of it is we had a nice coalition, including public hospitals, and we opposed this, and it moved no further than two committees in the Senate and was never heard in the final committee. As to the surtax, again, we worked with a similar coalition. All the public entities that are subject to the benefits of sovereign immunity also are in the business of borrowing money, and the notion that cities and counties, the notion that there would be a limit of 20 years on a referendum didn't sit well with them either. So when it came out of the House at 20 years, and I can go into more detail about how the tax package is handled. It's a unique piece of legislation. The short version is that it pops late in the session in the Florida House by tradition. It goes down to the Senate. The real work is done in the Senate because the House is more of a wish list. It goes down to the Senate where the real work is done and the negotiations take place literally behind the scenes. And we worked the Senate with our coalition partners to take that 20 years to a 30-year, which is the typical length of debt for these types of projects. And that is what ended up passing the Florida Senate and, again, the Florida House, because it went back to the House. And then Governor DeSantis signed this package into law on April 9th. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm available to answer any questions.
Thank you for your presentation. And do we have questions?
I have a question. I'm sorry. I don't know. This is Kathleen.
Okay.
I just would like to know, I find it interesting that I know everybody likes to have 30-year bonds or 50-year bonds, because those are usually, we hear that from bond people. But if the choice came down to a 20-year bond or nothing, are you saying that you would oppose a 20-year bond?
So what I would say is that what this did is put a cap on the length of time that the ordinance would be valid.
No, I understand. I understand that, yeah.
So what in a perfect world, there'd be no limit at all, right? The local community, local agency could make its own decision.
Well, it depends on whose perfect world that is. I think it's always good to go back and validate request for money and the expense that the money was used for. That's my opinion, but
I understand, and that could be your choice if there was no legislation on this issue. But you could do it every year if you wanted to, but the legislature required every 20, and then the extension was to every 30. So it ended up being 30. You could choose to do it, and you could choose to do it in a shorter period of time.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so with regards to if the ordinance were limited to a 20-year period and then you passed the ordinance and then took 2 years or a year and a half to issue bonds, then effectively you'd have to issue them for 18 and a half years. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, sir. Exactly.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Actually, as a money manager, I will suggest to Mr. Hardin's point, if there were a surtax that were limited to 20 years for the revenue stream, and you're bonding that revenue stream in order to invest capital dollars in efficiently rather than a long-term income stream, which obviously HART does need, but to do capital investments that would require bonding. The bond markets, while many of them have shortened to a 15-year standard, in some areas, capital investment typically require somewhere between a 20 and a 30-year maturity to, especially for a capital investment. So the issue associated with a 20-year surtax piece of legislation does actually require acknowledgement of our bonding market and where, when you go to market, where the pricing is for the underwriting, for any capital financing that's necessary. And I believe maybe some of the conversation in those meetings surrounded that as a key issue when it comes to how Surtax could actually fund for capital financing. So I just to make the point that, obviously it failed or didn't get through, but it does matter when it comes to how the HART operates when the Surtax revenues we were considering, that was for 30 years, did accomplish two goals. One, it allowed us to do some capital investing, but it also allowed us to create a revenue for some of the things other than operations that I think are important for us to acknowledge if we were to need to address Surtax revenue in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question with regards to this. Isn't it typical, and maybe someone else besides you will be there, but the federal grants that we typically get through for transit, the matches are usually require 30 years, don't they?
This is Mark Delagal. If that question's directed to me, I do not know.
Okay. Does Cindy Stieglitz, because I believe that is that you have to guarantee that you will operate. I've seen that over and over again requirement, especially if they hear that it was 18 years or something like that in terms of bonding, that could really hurt our ability to apply for federal transit grants. That really, because, I've heard that over and over again, repeatedly, a requirement. We have no one. Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you. For the record, Cindy Stieglitz, Interim CFO for HART. With respect to capital investment grants, I think you're talking about small starts, new starts, those types of larger grants, build grants. What is now Build used to be Tiger. Yes, you would want to have the ability to bond longer than 20 years for sure.
Right, because I think that would be would shut us down in so many ways.
But is that mandated? I think, Commissioner Kemp, I heard you say that you thought that it was federally mandated or suggested that it had to be at least 30 years, and I don't think that's the case. That's not what I heard the interim CFO say.
Heard from Ms. Stieglitz about the new starts and small starts, and yes, I understand that we have to demonstrate that we can match it for 30 years. That is the standard that they typically use. They don't want to fund it at the federal level without that local commitment.
That's not what I heard the interim CFO say, just for the record. I didn't, but if that's true, then that should be shared with the legislature.
and that I cannot confirm if it's mandated. I think it's one of those things they want to see the ability of the local match to be able to sustain the project. Right. But I can't say if it's a mandate or not. I apologize. I can certainly research that and let you know.
Yeah.
And I imagine that would affect your rating in terms of when they rate your project, whether they want to invest in it or not, if they don't feel certain that you can, support the project for the number of years, because they don't want to invest in a project that doesn't have the local sustained support. So I don't know that are there anyone else with their hands raised?
This is Dave Mechanic.
No, I apologize. I forgot to take my hand down. Thank you.
This is Dave Mechanic. I think I can shed some light on this. I think it's not a fixed 30 years. I think it is geared to the assumed useful life of the project that is being proposed. So if you were buying buses, for example, the funding stream would have to be available for the useful life of the buses, which is not necessarily 30 years, of course.
Right.
But other projects like the streetcar would be, I assume, at least 30 years.
Right. Thank you for that clarification. I think that is very much the federal standard. So I don't know if there's any other, Mr. Delagal, do you have anything else to add? No.
No.
Okay. So we will conclude this now. Thank you so much for your report. I do have, Mr. Delagal, I don't know if you're the person to answer this. This to me is the bigger overriding question that I'm wondering. In terms of the upcoming budget this year in Tallahassee, we are a state that supports ourselves with sales tax. And obviously sales tax revenue is down tremendously at this time. And maybe for many, many months to come. Can you please give us some, your perspective on what this could mean in terms of, all of our funding, not just with regards to HART, but in terms of transportation, in terms of everything?
Sure. This is Mark Delagal. I can give you my perspective, but before I do, I want to acknowledge that there are lots of perspectives that are out there. There are certainly people on this phone that have a very lot of background to give an awesome perspective. So this is just Mark's perspective, and it's somewhat still uninformed, but I'll give you what I think at this point in time. So the good news, I'll start with that, is that our first quarter of the year, we had a growth in revenue beyond projections. I think it was $141 million. The last quarter of the fiscal year, which started April 1, so that'll be April, May, and June. I think we can all expect that the monies we're in the fiscal year 1920 is going to be an issue with respect to revenue. The question is, do we have reserves to fill the hole, and how much is the hole going to be? I know there's a lot of calculations and budgeting people who spend their full-time day investigating this, led by Amy Baker in Tallahassee with the Economic and Demographic Research Unit of our state government. The next question I think is just out there is there's a lot of money in the CARES Act that's going to flow to the states. And the question is, and this is where I get in a little bit beyond my skis, but I know enough to kind of frame it for you. There's a debate as to whether, and Florida's share, the state government share of this money is somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 billion. The The question is that for, quote, COVID-related expenses, and is loss of revenue a COVID-related expense, or is it limited in a strict interpretation to only spending money to get ready to fight the COVID virus? Obviously, cities and counties and state governments want to have a broad definition of what a COVID-related expense is so that it can include lost revenues. If it is lost revenues, there's potentially several $billion that could make up a state funding shortfall from loss of sales tax revenues. And then the other thing I would point out, and this may be true in other places, but I do a lot of work in the healthcare system, and there's the Medicaid system is a matching system with half federal money, half state money. The feds have stepped up their share, so less state revenue is needed to do the same amount of work in the Medicaid system. So there's about more than $500 million in savings in state general revenue there. That is and that may be a similar scenario in other places. So all of that to say is the following. What I would say about this is there is a line of thinking that for the current fiscal year and maybe even into the next fiscal year, which starts July 1, and including some potential funding from what people are calling CARES Act version 3.5 or 4.0, there might be some federal assistance. The other extreme is we are in deep undesirable situation here, and we're going to have to come to Tallahassee and begin a dramatic reduction in the state budget. And so sometimes my personal view is influenced by hope. I know hope is not a plan. I get that. I'm optimistic that we will weather this as a state, and there will, at least in the short time, meaning in the next 60 days, there's not going to be a radical necessary trimming the existing fiscal year budget. And I'm optimistic that for the fiscal year beginning July 1, that we can feel our way for a bit until we know when this crisis ends and what other federal money might be available. So that's my view, but that's just one of, I can just tell you on this call, one of 10 that is legitimate. So I've taken up more time than I should have.
I just have one more question. Do you expect that there will be special sessions coming up on the budget?
I do not think there, as we sit here right this second, I guess I think it's 50-50 whether there'll be a special session. 2 weeks ago, I'd have said no for sure, but I think there could potentially be one. Now it's 50-50. That would be, and then as far as into the fall, either August, September, as we deal with the budget that the legislature just passed, that the governor has yet to receive, or act on, of course. I'm thinking that Director Shanahan may have been around when this happened. This is not a new thing. When there was a couple of years where Governor Bush had to call the legislature back in to session and trim $1 billion or $2 billion out of the state budget because revenues did not keep up with what was projected. I mean, that's always possible, but that would probably be September or October before something like that could occur. There's also a school of thought, and I know I'm kind of rambling, but there's just all these different views. There's also a school of thought that the governor, when he gets the budget for fiscal year 2021, he radically reduce it through the veto process, and in a sense mitigate or avoid a cut to it needing to be done into the future. So those are all things that are being talked about. I don't think anyone knows. Probably a lot of it has to do with at what point and to what extent does the economy rebound? Is that something that happens in a matter of months, or is that something that goes for a year? And then the other issue is how much federal money is going to be made available to states to make up for lost revenue.
Great. I appreciate that, and I appreciate your qualifying it. Yes. Commissioner Overman, you're recognized.
Mark, thank you very much for your report. I've been looking at the various different programs, CARES and COVID-19 programs, and the transit agencies have gotten a significant amount of opportunity to mitigate the impact due to COVID-19. The other issue that I wanted to sort of pick your brain at, and it's a bit of a stretch, but
one second. Somebody is breathing heavily into the phone. They need to mute.
Everybody needs to mute their phone.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Recently, due to COVID-19 and the pullback on our activities and closing down the economy, the Board of County Commission elected to not pursue a referendum in November to protect the revenue stream that is currently being collected under our Surtax. While we are still pending a ruling from the Supreme Court, the decision not to pursue putting it on the ballot, because it wasn't going to be a replacement, it wasn't going to be an additional tax, it was just to preserve the voters' will to preserve that tax. The board decided not to pursue that because they didn't feel that, given what's happening to our economy and given COVID-19, that it was not a time to pursue a tax. Would that leave those recipients of the Surtax dollars, if we were to get an adverse decision from the Supreme Court, with the ability to use the CARE transit-related dollars to replace those revenues, if we were able to do that application before the end of the year?
I think on this one, the most knowledgeable person on this call is the interim CFO. I've been on some calls with her in the past couple of weeks, and she's essentially an expert, and I bet she could give you the best answer. All I would be doing is repeating what she's told me.
Commissioner Overman, I'm thinking that this would be better served for a general discussion in terms of that.
That's fine, as long as we have a discussion on it at some point in time.
Yeah, I mean, I think at some point we do have to. But is there anything any more related to this? What is going on in Tallahassee? Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. We'll move now to I guess we have some information items. The automatic passenger count validation. Mr. Cochran?
So for the, just an update on our automatic passenger counter validation. Previously, for many years, we had manual ride checks that were occurring on the bus. We had 3 planning aides that would go out on the bus and do manual ride checks that would be required for us to make the reporting process to calculate passenger miles traveled for the National Transit Database annual reporting. That goes into our formula funding. At this point in time, we have received approval from the from FTA to no longer require the need of the manual ride check. The manual ride check people that we have on the buses at this point in time, we can do it all only with the automatic passenger counters. One thing to keep in mind at this point in time, we have almost 50% coverage of the automatic passenger counters on our bus, which means about, I would say, I want to say there are about 80 automatic passenger counters in our fleet, a little bit more. The more we have, the more accurate our data is. So I think down the road, we would like to keep in mind that, of course, every time we get a new bus that is turnkey, it comes with the automatic passenger counters in them already. So we will, just by attrition, improving that statistic of the number of automatic passenger counters that we have in our fleet. But that is just an informational item for you all to be aware of.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Okay, hearing none. I'm going to move to COVID-19 response communication. Jackie Haldell. Are there any questions?
No, sorry about that.
Okay, this concludes the regular business for today. Is there any old business? Is there any new business? I have an issue of new business, and I want to make sure that it's on the agenda for this committee and the board for the next meeting, and that is so that we can start to plan a fixed route service for downtown to begin in September. And I think we need to have a presentation on that from both SCP and our staff, not just our staff, but both of those. I'd like to see that, and I'd like to get that priced out. So I want to make sure that that's on our next agenda. Is there anyone else? Okay, hearing none, the meeting is adjourned.